What types of coverage should you look for in your employment practices liability insurance policy? My name is Ryan Stillwell. I'm the owner here at Stillwell Risk Partners, and I wanted to continue on from my previous video where we introduced employment practices liability, talk a little bit about what specific types of coverage you should look for in your policy, right? So in general, you generally get one limit for your policy, but it can be applied in several different categories, right? So typically a policy might be issued for $1 million for employment practices liability. Sometimes it is worthwhile to consider higher limits depending on the number of employees and how much you're paying them. But in terms of some of the specific coverage areas inside of the policy, there's a couple things that you'd want to look for. The first is, are defense costs inside that limit of coverage, or are they outside of it, right? So here's why it matters, right? Let's say you have $1 million liability policy for your employment practices policy. If your defense costs are within that limit, anything you pay in defense costs for that claim will withdraw from that limit. So you start off with $1 million and you have $100,000 in defense costs. All of a sudden, you're down to $900,000 in terms of a settlement or judgment, right? So for a lot of employers, $1 million, even if defense costs are inside, might be enough coverage for you. You know, small employers with only a handful of employees, you're not going to see any type of class action suit, most likely. You're not going to see any, you're not going to, if you, depending on how much you're paying your employees, you might not see a suit for more than a couple $100,000, right? So depending on the size of your business, it may be important to have that inside or outside the limit. But if the defense costs are outside the limit, right, and maybe there's a separate $1 million limit, or it's technically unlimited, right? You might have $1 million in coverage, right? And you have $100,000 in defense costs. That's not going to, you still have that $1 million in coverage for any potential settlement or judgment. It's not going to withdraw down your potential limits. So that's one of the first things that most businesses should look for, is what's in that policy. The second thing to look for is third-party liability coverage. You want to make sure that any employment practices liability policy that you're getting includes third-party liability. Now, what is that and why is it important? So third-party liability, right? So we think of it in terms of human resources insurance, right? If an employee sues us, if there's harassment at work or something along those lines. But discrimination and harassment can occur outside of your business from one of your employees. Let's say that you have a client-facing employee and they are discriminating against a certain group of people, and that group of people or one person sues your company because of that, right? And where is the coverage for that? It doesn't come from general liability. It comes from your employment practices liability insurance policy, and specifically with third-party liability. So if you have maybe a retail store, or you're a contractor, right, and you've got people that are interacting with your customers on a day-to-day basis, this can be very, very important to you. There's a third specific coverage that is not as easy to find as it used to be. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, is a regulation in place that makes sure that employers pay their employees what they're eligible for, right? It has a lot to do with overtime, with who's exempt and non-exempt, and salaried employees and things along those lines. And for small employers, this is a hard law to track. So oftentimes you rely on your payroll company to make sure you're setting things up right to do it that way. But in other cases, it really, the responsibility falls on the employer. So what can happen is, let's say that you had an employee or a group of employees that was eligible for overtime, but they did not get paid their overtime wages, right? So that group of employees might file a claim with the Department of Labor, and the Department of Labor comes in and takes a look at it and says, okay, we found that from this period of time, you should have paid your employees $50,000 more than you actually paid them, right? So you're not going to get coverage for that $50,000 that should have been paid in the first place, but you can sometimes get coverage for any regulatory penalties that are applied. Now, a lot of insurance carriers have backed off from offering this type of coverage because it is preventable. It is something that happens a little bit more frequently, and there are significant charges towards it. But if you can get that coverage, it's worthwhile, especially depending on the industry that you're in. So if you're new to understanding employment practices liability, these are three things that I'd recommend just checking with your policy or checking with your broker to see that they are included in the quotes that you're getting before you purchase the policies. Where are the defense costs? Are they inside or outside the limit? Do you have third-party liability included? Always get it included. It's usually not that much more expensive to include it. Always get it included when it's available, and most policies do have it available. And number three, do you have the option to purchase any type of coverage, even if it's just for regulatory expenses for Fair Labor Standards Act coverage?